I will be the third lecturer for the competitive programming curriculum. Today we will focus on conditionals or if-else statements and loops. The loops are divided into indefinite or while loops and definite or for loops. Please note that some of the slides are modified from a computer science lecture from a prestigious university. Let's go over what the conditionals or the if statement is. The if statement is the most simple decision-making statement, and it is used to decide whether a certain statement or a block of statements will be executed or not. There are three types of conditionals: the simple decisions or consisting of only ifs, two-way conditions or consisting of an if-else statement, and multi-way conditions or consisting of if statement, then one or more elif statement, then else statements. Note that elif is the abridged or shortened form of else if. The simplest form of conditional statement is the if statement. It is used to make a decision based on a single condition. Here's a sample structure in this slide. If the condition is true, the code block inside the if statement will be executed. If the condition is false, the code block is skipped and the code will continue. The two-way conditions involves both if and else statements. This allows to specify different actions for when the condition is true and when it is not. In this case, if the condition is true, the code under the if block is executed, and if it's false, the code under the else block is executed. This provides a binary decision. The multi-way conditions also adds elif or abridged form of else if in addition to if and else statements. Note that multiple elifs are possible, but at least one is necessary to qualify it as a multi-way condition. These are used for situations with multiple possible outcomes. In a multi-way condition, the conditions are evaluated in order. If condition 1 is true, the code block under the first if statement is executed. If it's false, the program checks condition 2 and so on. If none of the conditions are true, the code under the else block is executed. Here is a sample problem. If you want to try this problem, stop the video and try it. In this program, the variable x is initially set to 5. Since 5 is less than 15, it goes into the first if statement. Therefore, the else branch is skipped because the preceding if condition was true. So this means that we don't need to consider the else statement after the if statement. Also, the first if branch inside the if statement is skipped because its condition was false. Therefore, this program will print the string 2 and the answer is B. This is the flowchart for the first sample problem, and this is intended for code visualization. The circled part shows what is printed. Here is another sample problem with a minor change. If you want to try this problem, stop the video and try it. The change of this program will actually not affect the result of the code. I'll explain. Because the code passes the first if statement, or checking if x is less than 15, as x equals 5, the code will disregard the early statement because the previous condition was true. Also, the first if branch inside the first if statement is skipped because its condition was false. Therefore, the answer is B again. Let's go through one simple programming problem and one more complex problem. Here is the first problem, and this is the URL, and here's the problem statement translated to English. If you want to try this problem, stop this video and try it. Here is my code for this problem. In the first line, just like in lecture 2, if you want to get 2 or more integers or other data types in one line, then you use the map function. Remember that map is a function that works as an iterator to return a result after applying a function to every item of a sequence or an iterable. Then we use the if-elif else statement or multi-way condition to determine what will be printed or outputted. According to the problem statement, it says that if A is greater than B, then we should print the greater than sign, and if A is less than B, then we should print the less than sign, and if A equals B, then we should print equals equals or 2 equals sign. We use the if statement to check if A is greater than B. If this is true, then this would print the greater than sign. If this is false, the code goes into the elif statement to check if A is less than B. If this is true, then this would print the less than sign. If both of the two conditions are false, then we print equals equals. So there are two key takeaways for this problem. First, use the map function if you want to get input for two or more of the same data types in one line. Second, there are three cases for this problem, so if, elif, else, or multi-way conditional is necessary for this problem. This is a more complex problem with more than three cases, and here is the URL. If you want to try this problem, stop this video and try it. And of course, this is the problem statement in English. This was actually a past Canadian computing competition, CCC problem. So you will get a taste of what a competition problem will look like. Here is the solution for this problem. First, since there is only one integer per line, you don't need to use the map function. Then you use the if statement to check whether both x and y are greater than 0, which is in the first quadrant. We use the logical AND function in order to determine if all of the conditions in the same if or elif statement is true. And although the logical OR isn't present in this problem, we use OR to determine if any of the conditions is true. Then, we use two elif statements to check whether the point x, y is in the second quadrant and the third quadrant respectively. Then, if all of the conditions return false, then we go to the else statement and print 4. Now, you might think about the cases when x equals 0 or and y equals 0. However, the problem statement specifically mentions in the input format section that both x and y will not equal 0. In other words, there will be no input that will cause x equals 0 or and y equals 0, so you can disregard this. So there are four key takeaways to this problem. First, the map function is not necessary because there is only one data type per each line of input. Second, there are four cases, so if, elif, else, or multi-way conditional is necessary for this problem. 3. We use the logical AND to determine if all of the conditions in the if or elif loop statement is true, and we use OR to determine if any of the conditions is true. Lastly, for this problem, we don't need to consider the x equals 0 or and y equals 0 cases because the constraints mention that x and y will not equal 0. Let's now go deep into loops. There are two types of loops, the indefinite while loop and the definite or for loop. We will focus first on the indefinite or while loop first. We use an indefinite loop when the number of repetition or iterations you need is impossible to determine before the loop begins, or more simply, not obvious. An example of an indefinite loop is guessing a number between 1 and 99 because we don't know how many guesses it will take to guess that number. The best case scenario is that you guess the number in one time. The average case scenario is about 49 or 50 times. However, the worst case scenario is not 99. It could be infinite. You could occasionally say the same number twice during your guess, and it is therefore not definite. While loops are considered indefinite loops for the number of repetition is unknown before the loop begins, and the repetition depends on a condition. Below, on the blue colored box, is the syntax for the Python's while loop. The first step to evaluate a while loop is to evaluate the loop test, which is a Boolean expression, or an expression that tests whether the statement is true or not. If it is true, execute the statements inside the while loop and go back to the first step. This will happen indefinitely until the condition is false, and if it is false, skip the statements inside the while loop and go to the statement after the loop. If you are confused with the difference between the if statement and the indefinite loop, or if you want to differentiate between the if statement and the indefinite loop, here is a slide for you. In an if statement, the true block is evaluated at most once, not twice or an indefinite number of times. However, in a while statement, the body of the statement can be evaluated multiple times, provided that the test remains true for every time it runs. Let's practice the indefinite loop by filling the blanks to complete the function. You will eventually know how to make functions in Python in the 5th lecture, but this exercise is intended to practice the indefinite loop. We are going to fill out the isComp function where if the given parameter, integer n, is composite, it returns true and returns false if n is prime. We will be going to fill in the first blank right after while in order to check if n is composite. We must loop through all of the divisors, so we must complete the while statement by filling out diff is less than n. We initially set diff to 2 because if diff was set to 1, then this function would return that all numbers are composite, which clearly isn't true. Similarly, if we set the while loop to diff is less than or equal to n, then this function will always return true. Here's the code filled after the first blank. Notice that when you divide n by the divisor and the remainder is 0, then we can simply return true since there is at least one factor that divides n that is other than 1 or n itself. The next task is to increment the divisor, because if we do not, then this will make the code run infinitely, as the divisor variable diff stays as 2. And because we will use a loop to check all the possible divisors, we, like this, increment the divisor by 1 each time when iterating the loop. And if the while loop iterates through n minus 1, then it goes out of the loop and it should return false since it is guaranteed that n is prime in this code. It is guaranteed like this because we have checked all of the possible divisors of n, not including 1 and n itself, and since no number between these two values inclusive are divisible by n, it is prime. Here is another non-working version of the code. You may encounter this kind of mistake while you code at some time, but if we put else return false after the if block, then the while loop will run at most once, because if n is not divisible by diff, which is initially set to 2, then the function would automatically return false. It might seem true, but there's a counterexample. Think of 9. 9 is not divisible by 2, but it's divisible by 3, making it a composite number. But in this function, isComp9 will return false, signifying that 9 is a prime number, but it isn't clearly true. As a result, the program will eventually return too early. Before moving on to the practice problems, we will go into the definite or for loops. Here is an example of the for loop, and the repeated statements inside the for loops are called the body of the loops, and it must be indented the same amount. Here is the general syntax for the definite loop in Python. It is for a variable in sequence, then colon, then the body of the loop. The variable can be any valid variable name, but the most commonly used variable is I, just like in the example on the right. For each value in the sequence, the value is assigned to the variable and all statements in the body of the loop are executed using that value. Once all values in the sequence have been processed, the program continues with the first statement after the loop. Here is the flowchart for executing a for loop. If the sequence has more values, then the loop assigns the next value in the sequence to a variable and then executes the statements in the body. Then it checks again to see whether the sequence has more values to execute. If not, then it executes the statements after the loop. Here is the syntax of a simple repetition loop that repeats a loop's body n times. For I in range n colon, then body of the loop. For example, if you want to print I'm filling loop p 5 times, then you would do for I in range 5 colon, print I'm filling loop p. Here is a sample programming problem for you to try. Although this can be solved with just 2 print statements, try it both using definite and indefinite loops. If you want to try this problem, stop the video. And here is the English version of the problem. I solved this problem by using a definite loop. Although solving with an indefinite loop is possible, since we are printing a string exactly 2 times, using a definite loop is much better. Also, in order to print a string, make sure to enclose it via single quotes or double quotes. and make sure that the print statement is intended. Here is another programming problem for you to try. If you want to try this problem, stop the video. And here is the English version of the problem. I also solved this problem using a definite loop. First, you enter the input from the user and use the definite loop iterating through n. Then we print asterisks or stars for I plus 1 times for I in range n because I is initially set to 0 and we don't want to print 0 stars in the first line. In fact, we want to print 1 star in the first line, so we add 1 to I to print the stars. Also, in order to print the same character multiple times, we use the multiplication sign or asterisk of a string. So there are two key takeaways for this problem. First, we put I plus 1 instead of I because we want to print 1 star in the first line and I equals 0 initially in the first iteration. And second, in order to print the same character multiple times, we use the multiplication sign or asterisk of a string, and this also works for lists. Thank you for listening to this long lecture and see you next time.